Starved Rock National Park is very picturesque in the American state of Illinois. The park is located 144 kilometers west of Chicago on the rocky banks of the Illinois River. There was once a French fort and an Indian reservation here, but there are few reminders of their presence. There is only a small exposition in the tourist center and the park's name. Starved Rock is literally starved rock. The park got its name because of an indigenous legend. It says that in the 1760s, when the chief of the Ottawa tribe visited the tribal council in Illinois, he was killed. To avenge the chief's death, the tribe members, along with their allies, drove a band of Illinoisans to the top of a cliff and surrounded them. They were held there until all who were on top starved to death. Some of the warriors tried to escape in desperation, but they were killed in the surrounding woods. That's how the name of this rock and later the entire park came to be. But to think about the gloomy past of these places, modern visitors to the park do not want to think about it at all. It is popular all year round. Starved Rock is one of the most beautiful places in the state. The park has many trails, canyons, and waterfalls. From the cliff, there is a stunning view of the Illinois River. Time seems to flow differently here. But in 1,960 years, the peaceful atmosphere of Starved Rock Park and its surroundings became just a memory overnight. On March 17th, the bodies of 3 women were found in one of the canyons. The murder case of Mildred, Lillian, and Frances would be thoroughly investigated. But the controversy about what happened would continue even 60 years later. Why? Let's try to understand. Mildred Lindquist, Lillian Oetting, and Frances Murphy were 3 friends. They lived in an affluent suburb of Chicago, 5 minutes from each other. The women often attended the Presbyterian church together. At the time of the events, Mildred and Lillian were each 50 years old, and Frances celebrated her 47th on her birthday. Lillian was married to George Oetting. Together, they raised 3 children. Lillian's brother thought no person was more kind and charitable than his sister. Mildred was married to Robert Lindquist. They had 2 children. Mildred spent much time on the school board and took an active part in the lives of her and Robert's children. Everyone who knew the woman personally remarked that Mildred was a fantastic person. She always had a smile on her face and could handle any difficulty. Frances became the wife of lawyer Robert Murphy. Like her friends, she was on the school board. The couple had 4 children. The mother of many children spent her days caring for her children. But Frances also had a hobby. She loved growing roses. She had a talent for gardening. Her well-tended garden was the envy and admiration of her neighbors. Frances used her talent to help tidy up the gardens and flower beds of the city. Unfortunately, more detailed information about the heroines of this story could not be found. Everything happened in the 60th year, so it is impossible to cover the victims' biographies comprehensively. From the words of their relatives, it is known that they planned the trip to Stardock several months in advance. It was decided to leave the husbands at home. The women were going to spend 4 days in nature, the trip the friends were looking forward to. For each of them, it was to be a kind of reboot. Lillian Oetting had been caring for her husband all winter. Earlier, he had suffered a heart attack. She dreamed of spending a few days away from home. She wanted to change scenery, walk in the fresh spring air, listen to birdsong, and spend time with close friends. The women planned hiking and chose accessible routes, as one had back problems and a displaced spinal disc, so she couldn't go on long-distance hikes. On Monday, March 14, 1960, the women loaded their luggage into Frances's car and set off toward the park at about 10 in the morning. Mrs. Murphy parked her gray station wagon in the Stardock Lodge Hotel parking lot at about 12:20. The women then checked in at the front desk and were escorted to rooms 109 and 119. The friends dropped off their bags and returned to the front desk to get lunch coupons from the receptionist. The friends had a snack at the local dining room and walked. It was about 1 o'clock on the clock. Although the calendar spring had already started, the path in the park was covered with snow. The friends put on rubber galoshes and strolled through the park, slipping now and then. They stopped occasionally to take pictures. The women reached a dead end at St. Louis Canyon, where cliffs framed a majestic frozen waterfall. This spot is only 1.5 kilometers from the hotel. The canyon is a chasm about 45 meters deep, with a single entrance. There are also dark caves in the canyon's depth, formed from frozen water from the glacier. They go about 4.5 meters deep. Lillian set up Francis's cameras and took a few pictures. Then, the women turned around. They were going to walk back. This is where it gets confusing. So much so that the only analogy I can think of is hair with gum in it. That image has popped up for me several times throughout this story, and I think you will soon understand why. Evening comes, and according to some reports, Lillian's husband, George Oting, tried to contact his wife. She promised to call him herself, but since she never did, George called first. The receptionist at the front desk said it was impossible to transfer the call to Lillian's room. No one was there. He assumed the ladies would return later and promised to tell Lillian her husband had called. Oting hung up and went to bed. According to other sources, none of the women had called their husbands on Monday evening, and they had not reached the hotel. This is very strange, though. Trom women coming alone to a hotel in the 60s was a pretty progressive decision. A woman was a sort of appendix to a man back then, so it's suspicious that no one wanted to contact them on the evening of the first day of their trip to find out about the experience and the weather, at least their children. The women, I recall, had 9 of them for 3. Had they not called their mothers? Apparently not. So, the second version is that it wasn't until Tuesday morning that George called the hotel and asked to be connected to his wife. The employee who answered the phone told the excited man that the 3 girlfriends had been seen at breakfast. They allegedly had a note in their logbook that the women had attended breakfast. Calmed by this response, Oting hung up the phone. And that night, a belated winter storm hit the Illinois River Valley. It was one of the coldest days of that season. About 6 inches of fresh snow fell in St. Louis Canyon. It covered all tracks. The blizzard continued through the night. The trails in the park became virtually impassable. On the morning of the 16th of March, Wednesday, about 7 o'clock, Francis Murphy's husband called at the hotel. He reported that his wife had come to Stardrock as early as Monday with her friends, but nothing has been heard of her or her friends since then. Terry Martin, an employee of the hotel, promised to check the guest rooms. He sent 2 cleaners there. They inspected the rooms and told him that the women's beds were made and their belongings were not unpacked. That's the first theory. According to the second version, the beds are also untouched, but some belongings are neatly laid out in a locker. There are no formal documents, photographs, or affidavits about the writing of the rooms. There are no formal documents, photos, or affidavits about the writing of the rooms. Attorney Andy Hale, whose podcast I was listening to, also wondered about this, and I highly recommend it to you. And a fundamental question: why were the rooms only checked on Wednesday? So they weren't cleaned on Tuesday? And why didn't Mrs. Murphy's husband call until Wednesday? So he was okay with her not contacting him on Monday. She didn't get him on Tuesday. It wasn't until Wednesday morning that he decided he should have dialed. These are unanswered questions. In the meantime, hotel staffers continued their search for the women. They looked in the parking lot. Francis's car was still parked there. It was covered in snow, so they hadn't gone anywhere. That same Wednesday, the husbands contacted each other, and Terry Martin called the police. It was 8:20 in the morning on the clock. LaSalle County Sheriff Ray Uty arrived about 9:15 a.m., 45 minutes after Mr. Martin's call. He immediately began questioning the guests in the hotel's dining room. He hoped that someone had seen the missing woman. The hotel staff was also asked, but no one seemed to have seen the friends, and no one could even say when they were last seen. All right. But what about the breakfast on Tuesday, which is marked that they attended? Why didn't any of the guests see them then? Or why didn't anyone say they were seen sitting across from me? There's a bit of a strange theory about that. Perhaps the concerned husband was lied to by the hotel staff. This policy used to be at some hotels where people sometimes came to meet their lovers. So it was decided to the worried spouses not to reveal the truth that the woman, for example, did not spend the night at the hotel. Why would the hotel take on such a responsibility and get involved in someone else's marital twists and turns? So maybe they said, "Yes, yes, yes, mister, what's your name?" "Well, sure, yeah, she slept over." And they're like, "Okay, the woman's cheating." Or maybe the hotel logbook that marked breakfasts and dinners was just negligently entered and checked off randomly so that everybody showed up. And that was it because nobody needed it, and they didn't check really who was and who wasn't. Meanwhile, the search was in full swing. It was decided to check other hotels in the vicinity of the park. Suddenly, the woman decided to stay there due to some circumstances. The hospitals were also called, but no reassuring information could be found. The friends' husbands moved toward Star Rock Park, and the sheriff began organizing search parties. The police decided to involve the Boy Scouts, or the boys, who were sent to a children's reform camp. Henry Wolford was a camp officer of the Illinois Youth Commission. Henry arrived at the park with 5 young men at about 11 o'clock. Wolford had lived in these parts long enough to know the park and its surroundings well. As a camp staff member, Henry often worked in that park, including working with the children. They kept it clean. Terry Martin suggested that Henry and his boys tour St. Louis Canyon. This place was popular with tourists during the winter because of the frozen waterfall. The search party moved out there at about 12:30. Moving to the canyon on foot, the searchers closely scrutinized every meter of the path. At one point, the group faltered as if anticipating trouble. Around this time, local newspaper reporter Bill Denley was finishing up the last report of his shift for the afternoon newscast. When he received a report of the mysterious disappearance of 3 women, he grabbed his camera and headed down the snowy roads toward Stardrock Park. Denley was at the west entrance to the park when he noticed a boy running down an icy ravine toward the road. Bill pulled into the parking lot and saw several other young men. They were loudly discussing that they had found bodies in the cave. Denley recognized the boys as Boy Scouts from the Lenoir Youth Commission's forest camp. The reporter himself had once worked there. The reporter took the boys aside to ask them a few questions, and the kids told him that in one of the canyon's caves, searchers had found, quote, horribly mutilated bodies. Bill Denley called his colleagues. Within minutes, the news traveled across the country. Bill Denley was one of the first journalists to enter St. Louis Canyon. He saw the bodies themselves. It was an extremely gruesome sight. 2 women were lying side by side on their backs with their legs spread wide apart. The third was 1.5 meters away from them. All of them had their clothing below the waist, either torn or missing. This suggested that the motive for the crime was sexualized violence. The whole scene was like a scene out of a horror movie. It only took one look at the bodies to realize that each had been struck dozens of times in the head. But their naked legs were bruised as well. Mrs. Murphy's pelvic area was also visibly bruised. Lillian and Mildred's wrists were bound, but not tightly. The rope had been cut. Mrs. Murphy's camera was found 3 feet away. Its leather case was covered with blood and the strap was torn. Also found at the scene was Frances's bloody binoculars. It had been broken into 2 pieces. One of the women's gloves had been ripped off her hand. The other woman's jacket was lying nearby. A pair of glasses, broken in blood, also lay near the bodies. But what was most frightening was that the whole scene seemed to be on display as if it carried some message. The bodies were lying on a dais. Someone had put them there on purpose. This wasn't an attack that could be easily explained. So what could it all mean? The entire canyon was covered with nearly 15 inches of snow. It was now to be carefully melted to expose any possible tracks. The ice had been melted with flamethrowers, which didn't seem like a good idea after a few years, considering that the fire could burn necessary evidence, like hair or tiny bits of fabric from clothing. Detectives arrived on the scene. They organized searches of the immediate area. The LaSalle County District Attorney, Harlan Warren, was personally involved. He also happened to come across a frozen branch with traces of blood near the crime scene. There was also blood under that branch. He looked at this find and decided that this branch was the weapon. It was taken into evidence and described in detail. The branch was almost a meter long, 10 centimeters in diameter, and weighed 4.5 kilograms. The results of the inspection of the canyon and its surroundings led detectives to the idea that the women could have been attacked outside the cave, and only then were the bodies dragged there. By the way, the entrance to the cave is 1.5 meters above the ground, and the women were not straight inches. That is, ordinary women 40 to 50 years old. The crime scene was fenced off with a special tape, and the bodies were not moved until forensic experts and representatives of the State Crime Laboratory arrived. The experts worked in the canyon until late into the night. Lillian's loved ones, Francis and Mildred, hoped the women would be found alive to the last. Mr. Lindquist, upon learning of his wife's disappearance, was in such a hurry to join the search that he forgot to lock the front door at home. Neighbors noticed this and called the police. But when he arrived at the canyon, he was told the terrible news. The canyon women were taken to a funeral home for a thorough examination and cover-up. The exact date and time of death was difficult to determine, all because of the cold. As we recall, unprecedented snowfall hit that area after their disappearance, and temperatures stayed negative. However, experts have suggested that the women were attacked on the day they arrived, in the afternoon. Multiple blows with a heavy blunt object caused death. Specifically, over 120 blows were inflicted with different objects. Some of the blows left semicircular marks. Some of the weapons were sharp-edged. Photos of the scene are online, and if you're interested, you can find them. But just so you understand the force with which the blows were delivered, I will say that the women were unrecognizable, in fact, without faces, without eyes, so whoever did this dry and clean couldn't get away with it. There would have been marks on him, too, because the face has a lot of tiny capillaries, and the splashes would have been everywhere. As for the weapon, detectives concluded that a camera and binoculars were probably used. And there's that stick since they found remnants of wood chips in one of the women's skulls. Anyway, it was minimal, just wood splinter residue. It's not like there's a whole huge chunk of wood. But you and I will touch on all of that. The same cold and lack of technology prevented us from finding evidence of rape. So from the unsub's point of view, there was no rape. There was just no trace of semen. Damage is just hard to document. And indeed, after they'd been lying in such a cold, open area for days, it would be next to impossible. And the question remains open. Mainly, there are times when there is no damage at all. But we do remember that Mrs. Murphy had bruising in the groin area. There were bloody, smeared fingerprints on the combination worn by one of the women and on the pair of stockings and belt. Their location led to the conclusion that they belonged to the assailant or assailant. What's more interesting is that in the photos, it can be discerned that the two women were wearing scarves. During the autopsy, it's true that it looks like they switched scarves. The subject experts also indicated that one of the women was wearing sweatpants, but that was not the case. So either the examination was poorly done, the clothes were mixed up, or the women changed clothes and switched things. The whole neighborhood was, as they call it, on its ear. People were afraid to go out on the streets and canceled trips to Starved Rock, which is understandable and expected. The police were under incredible pressure. They needed to solve this case as soon as possible, and they, in principle, would have been happy to, except no one had any experience. None of the assigned detectives had ever handled a case this serious before. This was their first big case. The first place they looked for the suspect was the hotel. On the day the women disappeared, there were 26 guests and 46 employees at the Starved Rock Lodge. In all, 62 people worked there. They were all interrogated, and even polygraph tests were conducted. There was a reward for any information that would help arrest the perpetrator. $30,000. And at the time, that was a lot of money. You could buy 2 houses with that money. Authorities announced their intention to interview all LaSalle County criminals because the motive of abusing women has not been discounted despite forensic evidence. The version considered was that someone driving by the park in a car saw the 3 women parked, followed them on foot, and attacked them. According to another version, the perpetrator lurked in the park, waiting for victims. Authorities even told reporters that they have evidence of the latter version. What made the case particularly intriguing? They developed photos from Francis's camera. And photos in cases like this, especially if the victims took those photos, it's just a separate kind of cold sweat running down your back, and goosebumps. Just imagine if you managed to take a picture of the attacker. It's hard to explain, but I remember the Listen Fron case and, what was the other girl's name? Panama, anyway. And there were some bizarre pictures there, too. And it's just chilling to this day what those pictures meant, why they took them, whether they were trying to scare them off, or whether they were trying to take photos to investigate who was hiding in the bushes and attacking them. So, it's not so simple here in this case either. There are 4 photos in total. And in one, the creepiest of them all, the 2 friends, Francis and Mildred, are standing in front of the cave. And behind the trees, a silhouette is clearly visible in the background. Also, it looks like it's holding something heavy and significant in its hand, with the stranger's other hand clasped against its body. Detectives even attempted to put together a portrait of the man. He looks about 30 years old. His height is close to 182 centimeters, and his weight is about 72 kilograms. But to be fair, some were not interested in this find. Perhaps it is an illusion accidentally created by the double exposure. Does it give any clue? No. Does it look creepy? Yes. Meanwhile, the search for the perpetrator or perpetrators continued. At the beginning of the investigation, it was decided to put up roadblocks all along Highway 178 and near Highway 71. They passed near the park. Every car was stopped. The police hoped that they could find witnesses rather than suspects this way. In case someone saw something suspicious, a group of people stopped for some reason near the park that day. Police also assessed the appearance of drivers and passengers, see if they had fresh scratches or bruises on their faces. They were also looking for a suspect among the poachers. The reasoning was as follows. They often carry ropes and pickaxes. Plus, a week after the murders, several articles were published in which authorities described a fierce crackdown on illegal hunters over the winter. Detectives speculated that maybe the unfortunate women had seen something they shouldn't have and were dealt with for it. But that theory was never confirmed. There were specific suspects. Thus, under the scrutiny of the police was a particular groom who worked in a stable near the canyon. The cops went to talk to him. Maybe he had seen or heard something suspicious that day. The stableman was acting very strangely. He seemed agitated. His clothes were unkempt. Then he was brought in for closer questioning, but the stable boy disappeared. And there's no information about what finally happened to him or where he is. So, detectives went to a psychiatrist for a profile of the killer. He said they were looking for a sadistic sex maniac. He probably acted alone. According to the psychiatrist, he might commit a similar crime if not found. Meanwhile, a month passed. On the 21st of March, a man from LaSalle said he was driving along the highway at about 14:00 on the day of the attack. He witnessed a scene in the stable that seemed very strange to him after the news of the attack. The man saw a brown-beige car pull up to the three women in the parking lot. Out of it stepped a young red-haired guy looking about 25 years old, of average height. He wore a yellow jacket, blue pants, jeans, or slacks. The young man started talking to the women. Another male passenger was sitting in the car at the time. Later, though, this witness said he saw a gray car, not a brown and beige car. Later articles indicated that he drove through the area not at 14:00 but at 16:00. Anyway, the testimony, either he changed it, or somehow it was twisted, or he mixed up something. It's not clear either. Then, on March 26th, the police received intriguing new information. Two women and a 12-year-old girl had been walking in Matheson State Park on March 12th, 2 days before the attack on the three friends. This park is adjacent to Rock Park. The women said that while they were walking, they were approached by a guy with a camera. He tried to start a conversation with them and take them deep into the park, but the women were able to get away from the strange, rusty-haired young man. According to the witnesses, he looked to be about 25 years old. His height and other parameters matched the description given to the suspect by the other man who saw the parked car. While the police were trying to identify this wry-haired guy, another thorough search was conducted in the canyon and the surrounding area. Even water was pumped out in St. Louis, hoping to find more evidence. The search turned up red fibers of cloth near the cave. Similar fibers had been found earlier on clothing and bodies, though neither woman wore anything red, so that could also be evidence. But despite active police action, the investigation has been deadlocked almost from the start. There were few real clues and evidence, and the theories about what had happened became more and more insane as time went on. The investigation gradually came to a standstill due to bureaucratic delays. The fact is that County Attorney Harlan Warren, a hard-working and respected official, was technically in charge of investigating the case. However, the Illinois State Police retained their authority in the case because everything happened on park property, which was, appropriately, under their jurisdiction. And Warren found himself in a desperate situation. He was forced to cooperate with state authorities because the police around Golisol had no experience solving such crimes. Time passed. The investigation was not progressing, and doors that no one had ever locked before were now chafed shut. Hardware stores couldn't handle the influx of customers, and specialty stores and guns began to disappear from sale quickly. The Starfrog Lodge Hotel, where the women were staying, was deserted. Some motorists were willing to take roundabouts to avoid passing Starfrog Park. This put pressure on the police officers, especially at the Harlan Warren County office. They were being pressured to make some progress. And there was pressure from within, too, because the election for a new prosecutor was looming, and money was another problem. The cost of the investigation was skyrocketing. A hotel owner named Spy Roos and his son volunteered to be fingerprinted. Maybe he wanted to demonstrate that he was an upstanding citizen and set an example for others. Or maybe he just wanted to get his family off his back as soon as possible to restore the tourist flow. The hotel owner also donated $5,000 for further fingerprinting work because an entire department had been set aside. Both he and his son, George Spyrouse, passed the polygraph test. In one of the interviews with the police, George was wearing a red plaid jacket. As it turned out, several things in his closet were red, which alerted the police, and they were taken for analysis. But, as Andy Hale said, he didn't provide the police with all the items. Some sweatshirt, as he put it, was either in the wash or lost somewhere. Well, not everything was examined, and the fibers from none of his clothes matched the evidence found at the scene. While fingerprint checks and interrogations were going on, Warren made another desperate attempt to solve the case. He realized he needed helpers to succeed in the investigation. So, instead of choosing someone from his staff, he enlisted 2 county detectives who became solely answerable to him. Their names were Bill Dammit and Wayne Hass. They were, in his opinion, trustworthy and intelligent. The detectives would not reveal details of their investigations to reporters, who were already kicking cops around looking for a scoop. This was the parallel investigation that had to be conducted in secret. At one point, Warren even stopped sharing leads and discussing the case with colleagues outside his inner circle. And these guys, Dammit and Hass, they're noteworthy because they were, the typical cops of the 50s, 60s, the kind of guys who catch criminals, playing, psychological games with the suspects. Bad cop, good cop. They think they're always right and must punish all the neighborhood's bad guys. Memorize their faces. They'll play an essential role in the investigation. Meanwhile, spending his nights in the squad room, the prosecutor took another look at the list of evidence collected. His attention stopped on the twine that the perpetrator had tied the 2 women together. According to some reports, Warren had used his money to buy a microscope and began scrutinizing the evidence. Thus, he discovered that 2 kinds of twine, consisting of 20 and 12 strands, had been used. They were tied together to make the rope stronger. Where could the criminal have gotten this rope? The first thing to do was to check the storerooms in the hotel. Without much difficulty, Warren found both kinds of twine in the kitchen in large spools. So he concluded that the rope with which the women were bound was no doubt from the stock in the hotel kitchen. At the prosecutor's suggestion, many of the hotel employees were again subjected to polygraph examinations. Faced with the fact that they had all passed the tests successfully and had not aroused any suspicion, Warren wondered if they had gotten the result. He decided it was time to run some tests of his own. He hired a specialist from a well-known Chicago firm and called in all the employees who had worked during the week the crimes had occurred for additional testing. One by one, the employees came up to a small shack on the hotel grounds and were tested. The first dozen passed the test with no problems, and then Warren and his assistants began to wonder again if they were wasting their time. Bill Dammit then invited a dishwasher named Chester Otto Weger to come in. While checking on Weger, Warren noticed that the face of the examiner conducting the examination had turned pale. He turned to the police officers and quietly said, "This is the man you want." Chester was a thin, short man. It's hard to imagine such a thing these days, but by the time he was 21, he had a wife and 2 small children. He had worked at the Park Hotel until the summer of 1960, and then quit to work with his father and become a house painter. Dammit remembered Chester's name from an earlier police report, and yet the young man had never been under the suspicion of the detectives. He was questioned on March 16th or 16, and Chester told his alibi then. At lunchtime on the day of the murder, he was alone in the hotel. The young man was writing a letter to his mistress. Chester said he picked up a pencil and paper at the front desk. Then, for some time, Weger was in plain view of everyone. He said he even turned up the music on the jukebox loudly. The appearance of the guy during the first interrogations was not accurately described. In later interviews with the police, they will say that there are scratches on his face, and whether someone noticed it, or whether the police themselves pointed it out, or whether there were no scratches at all. However, according to some sources, Chester has said he cut himself while shaving, and from that point on, Chester Weger would be the focus of all attention. On September 27th, Chester was taken to Chicago, Sheriff Dammit and Assistant State's Attorney Craig Armstrong did it. Chester was sent there for a polygraph test. John Reed was supposed to do it. It was to be his 6th so-called polygraph test. The officers questioned Chester for the rest of the next day until about midnight. They tried to coerce a confession out of him and used psychological pressure. But when Chester said, after hours of questioning, "You're following the wrong man," they let him go. But instead of taking the guy home, an assistant state's attorney interrogated him for another 4 hours. Warren decided to do a thorough background check on this young man. Let's get to know him, too. Chester Weger was born in Iowa in the year 1939 to Herschel and Juanita Weger. The couple raised a total of 5 children. When Chester was 2 years old, they moved to Illinois. The Weger family lived very poor. There was no water in the house. Meat was mainly obtained by hunting. They grew their vegetables. Chester spent a lot of time outdoors. Such a childhood can hardly be called carefree. When Chester was 12, he was accused of sexualized violence. According to him, one day Chester was walking home after school and heard a child crying. It turned out it was a girl he knew well who was calling. She told him she had just been raped. Chester helped this girl get dressed, stopped the bleeding, and brought her home. However, the girl eventually pointed him out as the one who had attacked her. Chester pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to probation because he was a teenager at the time. However, this is also one of the confusing parts. Because the incident is officially recorded as an assault that Chester himself committed, and not from the words of the girl, but simply the documents even state that his parents saw traces of blood on his pants. So this only adds to his suspicion of what happened at Starved Rock Park. Well, one would imagine that's roughly what the detectives were thinking. Yep, he's capable of doing this, so basically he could have attacked these women. But what was strange was that Chester was cooperating with the police. He gave up his deerskin jacket so the lab could study the suspicious dark stains on it. And when asked about that jacket, he said, "Oh, I don't even know where it is right now. I think my wife put it on." And so it turned out they came home to pick up this jacket, and his wife was wearing it. And about those stains, it's unclear, too. At first, they thought it was the blood of an animal, a raccoon or a rabbit that Chester was hunting. Then they said no, it was human blood. But as far as you can see from the photographs and Andy Hale's description, it was just spatter. I mean, unhealthy droplets, not marks that they tried to wipe off and just embedded themselves, but little, tiny little droplets. The critical point was that there were no cleaning products or marks on the jacket. And then, this jacket had just an exciting fate. It was shown to everybody. It could be touched, scouted, and put on public display. Everybody could feel it, look at it, open it, close it, touch it in that tag. It's fantastic. And at the same time, it's so much like a case from the 60s. It's just classic. In one of the interviews, the detectives asked Chester if he'd taken the twine from the kitchen. And he answered without hesitation that sometimes he did because he needed it for fishing or hunting. He knew how to make traps out of rope in a unique way. And when Warren heard that, he couldn't believe his ears. Well, I mean, he admits that he did have the rope. It seemed to him that the key to solving the case was practically in his hands. After it was discovered that Chester's jacket had tiny drops of blood on it, Warren organized a permanent stakeout of Chester. He was followed for a month. Well, I mean, straight up stalked him and his family, but it accomplished nothing. At the same time, Warren, DeMette, and Haas began checking out reports of assaults in the Stardock neighborhood. Thus, DeMette came across a report of a rape and robbery that had occurred about a mile and a half from Stardock in a nearby park called Madison. On September 13, 1959, a girl, her name withheld, went for a walk with her boyfriend. On one of the walks, as if out of nowhere, a young man with a shotgun jumped out at them. He ordered the girl to tie the boyfriend up with twine. She did so. The stranger then grabbed the girl and abused her. Afterward, she filed a police report. It is reported that Haas and DeMette then allegedly ignored the report and did nothing with it. And indeed, it didn't appear that anyone investigated the assault. Then, the teacher of the victimized girl, to whom Taras had told about the assault after hearing about the new case in Stardock Park, went to the police and recalled the September incident. Still, the assault is similar, and both could have a sexual motive. That's how Warren found out about the assault. With Warren's approval, the policeman approached the injured girl with a stack of photo slides. Slowly going through them, she saw Chester Weger and cried out. The girl's boyfriend also identified the attacker, also from the photos. But interestingly enough, the photo in which both boyfriend and girlfriend identified Chester was a group photo, and Weger was the only guy in his early 20s. The rest of the men were from a nearby prison and ex-convicts. 40s and older, grown men like that. I wonder why the detectives did this. And Chester denied the attack at first. But now Warren could have easily ordered Chester Weger arrested on this one charge because the girl had identified him. But he had to wait. The fact was that Warren was up for re-election, and if he had charged Weger with rape and murder right before the election, he would have been indicted by the defense attorney. They'd say he did it to keep his job. So, the prosecutor left Chester alone for a while. Warren had held the prosecutor's seat for about 8 years, but in the new election, another man took Warren's seat. The unsolved Stardock Park case affected the results, among other things. But Warren was still officially in office until December 1966, and could bring a case against Weger. Although the evidence of Chester's guilt was not as conclusive as the prosecutor would have liked, he obtained a warrant for the boy's arrest. True, only on the charge of rape, which was in the 59th year. Warren ordered Haas and DeMette to bring Weger to the station. The prosecutor had carefully planned the interrogation of Chester with his assistants. Warren believed that when the suspect had seen all the evidence collected against him, he would confess the crime himself. So, on November 16th, around 18:00, Haas and DeMette arrived at the young man's apartment and explained they had questions for him. They did not mention the arrest warrant, and once the detectives took Chester into custody, the questioning about the assault in Matheson Park began. Then, the partners started pressing him to plead guilty to the murder, too. Chester was held in an interrogation room until midnight. Then, weary of questions, an exhausted Weger stopped for a half-word and asked to see his family. A police car was dispatched to his parents' home. Detectives decided that Chester wanted to confess to his loved ones. When the mother and father were taken to the station, DeMette and Haas allowed them a few minutes alone with their son. In his official statement the next day, Haas said, So Chester Weger told everything he remembered about that day. On the morning of March 16th, Chester drove to work with a co-worker, as he did not have a car then. At the hotel, He set about his duties. He cleaned up the dishes for the guests after breakfast and lunch. At about 14:45, he began to take a short break. Chester took a short walk along the steep trail to St. Louis Canyon. There, he saw 3 women. Weger decided to rob them. Mrs. Murphy's camera, which he mistook for a wallet, Weger tried to take away at once, but the woman fought back. He grabbed the strap of the binoculars and tore it. The friends managed to fight back. Chester then somehow convinced the women that he wouldn't hurt them. He forced them to voluntarily follow him deep into the canyon, where they were trapped. Mrs. Lindquist said that Chester reminded her of her son, and that she did not believe this young man could harm them. According to Weger, another woman stated that her husband was on the police force, and Chester would never get away with what he had done. In the cave, Chester said he would tie them up so he would have a chance to escape because they might recognize him. And to this, the women agreed. However, one of them, Miss Murphy, untangled herself and tried to follow him. She hit him over the head with her binoculars, and he turned around and hit her over the head with a branch he'd found. Chester thought the woman was dead. Her eyes were closed. He dragged her into the cave. When the other 2 women tried to free themselves to fight him back, he began beating them as well. When asked why he dragged the bodies into the cave, he said he noticed a small airplane flying low over the park. The aircraft was white and red. Chester was afraid it might have been a police plane, so he moved the bodies so they could not be seen from above. A few days later, the flight over the park was confirmed by the pilot's testimony and the flight log. As the young man finished his confession, Chester knew how to get out of the canyon quickly, which was also considered a red flag, confirming his direct involvement. Leaving the scene, Chester washed the blood off his hands and pants with snow and returned to work. No one at the hotel guessed that he had just committed something so gruesome. Within minutes, Chester Weger transcribed and signed the confession on every page. Over the next few days, Chester confessed many more times to different people and even participated in an investigative experiment in the canyon. Reporters and police were there, and he showed exactly what he had done and how he had done it. Everyone who spoke to him noted the lack of even a shadow of remorse. Chester showed no emotion at all. And the case could end like this. There's a confession. It makes sense. There is no direct evidence, but it all adds up to a coherent picture. Except that on November 19th, after his first meeting with his court-appointed lawyer, not even 2 days after the confession, Chester declared himself not guilty, and that the confession had been beaten out of him. On November 22nd, he began to claim that he had been coerced into confessing to avoid the death penalty. He was threatened with the electric chair, so his confession is an absolute lie, and he signed the papers simply because he was scared. He said the detectives told him about the case. They showed him crime scene photos to make the confession believable. Specifically, he asked Mr. DeMitt to give him the information about the plane. Because Mr. DeMitt was a local aviation club member, he may even have flown this white and red airplane himself. Chester's family didn't believe he was guilty. His relatives told reporters that, in their opinion, Chester's confession was covering for someone, and he is not capable of such a thing. Later, Chester spoke of pressure not only on him, but also on his relatives. The police, on the other hand, denied the allegation of physical pressure and violence against the suspect. They reported that a doctor visited Weger after the interrogations, and he would naturally have documented any bodily injury that had been inflicted. But the guy seemed to be perfectly fine. But to be fair, psychological pressure can't be felt or seen on the body. That's why it's such a controversial point. In the interrogation texts, there is one bizarre question that Chester Weger was asked several times, over and over again, in different formulations. And Andy Hale noticed it. And when he just said that nobody paid any attention to it at all, and he was just casually leafing, and he was like, wow, what kind of question is that? Look, Chester is directly asked several times if he hit any of the women in the groin area, and Chester, having already made his confession and told everything, says, "No, I didn't beat anybody," right there. Then, the question is rephrased to mean these abrasions and bruises on Mrs. Murphy's body in the groin area. And Chester says, "No, I didn't hit her there. I didn't do anything to her at all." So why would he confess to such a brutal murder but not know anything about these bruises? Chester also didn't know that Mrs. Murphy had been defecated on, and the detectives asked him, "Did you urinate or leave feces on any of the women?" And Chester didn't understand the question at all. He confidently answered no to that question, even though he admitted it. Next, dark blonde hair was found on the glove of the same Mrs. Murphy and Mrs. Osing. Detectives analyzed them, and first, one lab said they were human hairs and most likely belonged to people of different ages, meaning one older and one younger. Then, the cops decided to send just one of these example hairs to some university, a very advanced lab. They sent only one hair, and it was a blonde hair. Guess why? Because Chester Weger has blonde hair. It's like they only suspected him and were trying to tie him to the case. And by the way, that hair wasn't his. The blonde hair found at the crime scene was not Chester Weger's. And that was never told to anyone. It was just, that's what they call it, buried in the paperwork. Andy Hale also found them by accident. Chester pointed to a branch as a weapon. And I think the most attentive and detective-minded of you have already noticed that it's very odd. Well, what branch? Especially if you know and have seen pictures of what happened there. Well, a branch can't do that kind of damage. And Chester didn't know that. Back on March 24th, the state lab said this branch couldn't have taken that kind of impact. This piece of wood was so rotten inside that it would simply break at the first blows. That's the official statement. But it wasn't sensationalized. It was just a newspaper article. And, well, Chester hadn't seen it and didn't know about this information. And the police didn't release that information to anyone. Chester didn't have a lawyer here to study these things and say, well, wait a minute. As we're now in the confession writing about this branch, and here's an official statement from the state lab saying that this branch is rotten inside. And if you hit it on the head, the branch will fly apart. One last thing, and this is one of the strangest parts of this whole story. The autopsy report found something very suspicious. It indicated that Mrs. Murphy, she was missing a phalanx. It was most likely cut off after her death. As we recall, Chester did not mention any such thing in his confession. He didn't have the finger on him either. It was cut off with a knife. And Chester didn't mention that weapon either. And the knife was never used in any of the murders. And have you noticed how many injuries or moments are connected to Mrs. Murphy? The bruising, the severed finger, the hair found on her glove, and that might seem pretty suspicious too. So, could Chester Weger be innocent? That's what we will continue to find out in our next installment. It's coming out in just a few days. So for now, I'll leave you with all this information. Take your guesses. If you've heard about this case, write down what you think, and add to it if there's anything important you want to write. In the next installment, you and I will touch on a wealth of information, from the evidence in favor of Chester Weger being guilty to the fact that Chester Weger wasn't even close. And we will also go over some new information in this case. It's been how many years, though, hasn't it? 60, right? But this case lives on. And I just read something exciting the other day. And I can't wait to share it with you all, If you're looking forward to part 2, please give it a like. In the meantime, I'll be saying goodbye for a while. Good night, everyone, and goodbye.